August 10th, 1945. Just one day after the city of Nagasaki vanished beneath a mushroom cloud, silence hung heavy across the ruins. The smoke had thinned, but the air still tasted of ash. Families huddled in the wreckage of wooden homes, their eyes red from both fire and tears. Survivors clawed at the earth with bare hands, searching for loved ones beneath collapsed beams and charred stone. Across the fractured neighborhoods, only the crackle of small fires broke the oppressive stillness, and then, through that silence, something unthinkable. A thin electric hum, followed by a voice. It drifted from a battered American field radio, a set left behind in the chaos of advancing troops and dropped supplies. The voice was steady, deep, and calm. It wasn't an order, it wasn't a coded message, it was music. Notes of jazz, carried on frequencies the civilians had never heard before, floated above the destruction. For those who stumbled near enough to hear it, the moment was surreal. Only hours earlier, steel and fire had rained from the sky, detonations shaking the foundations of an empire. Yet now, from a strange metal box, came melodies that spoke of another world. Trumpets and saxophones, alien instruments to many, filled the smoky air like a ghost from across the ocean. To ears accustomed to silence after raids, or the shrill wail of air raid sirens, it was impossible to comprehend. How could the very same Americans who unleashed thunderous bombers also possess machines that could conjure orchestras from thin air? In the rubble, civilians froze, listening as if to some divine broadcast. Mothers clutching children pressed closer, wide-eyed. Elderly survivors who had lived through years of imperial propaganda stared in disbelief. The empire had told them Americans were barbarians, soulless, mechanical destroyers. Yet this box, heavy with dials and wires, sang like a living creature. In villages untouched by the bombs but scarred by hunger, word spread quickly. Those who encountered American radios passed on stories that bordered on legend. It played music. One fisherman whispered to his wife. After the bombs, when nothing else remained standing, it played music. For rural farmers accustomed to still evenings broken only by cicadas, such tales were impossible to grasp. Radios existed in Japan, yes, but they belonged to the state. Carefully curated broadcasts, imperial decrees, patriotic marches, victory announcements were their only fare. Never had ordinary people heard music so spontaneous, so foreign, so alive. In towns where rumors traveled faster than trains, the idea seemed both terrifying and enchanting. Could machines really carry voices from across the ocean? Could sound survive where buildings had collapsed? The soldiers who carried these sets treated them as ordinary tools, unaware of the awe they inspired. To the Americans, field radios were lifelines, steel nerves stretched across a battlefield. They had been with them in the Pacific Islands, crackling through the humid jungles of Guadalcanal and the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima. When bombers screamed overhead, when tanks rolled across shattered terrain, the radios whispered constant instructions, jokes and reassurance. But to Japanese civilians, stumbling through the ruins of once proud cities, the radios appeared almost supernatural. The same machines that ordered fleets across oceans could also pull invisible songs out of the very air. Imagine standing in a flattened district of Hiroshima, where the ground itself still glowed faintly with heat. Survivors sat in silent despair, the weight of destruction pressing down like a physical force. And then, faint but clear, music cut through. The pluck of a bass, the swing of a drum, laughter between songs. Men and women lifted their heads as though the voice of the world itself had returned. The contrast was unbearable. Annihilation on one side, joy on the other. The music wasn't meant for them. It was simply the sound of Americans reminding themselves they were still human, still alive after battle. Yet to those listening in secret it carried something else, proof that the enemy lived in another dimension, one where destruction could coexist with beauty, and where machines brought not just commands but comfort. German soldiers had once spoken of the American radios with envy, clear signals cutting through static while their own FUG-5 units sputtered with noise. But for civilians in Japan, far from the technical comparisons of warfare, the revelation was emotional, almost spiritual. In a land where communication had been tightly controlled by the military state, These foreign voices felt like contraband from the heavens. If machines could carry songs across oceans, what else had Americans mastered? What other wonders lay beyond the empire's borders? Children were the most spellbound. Young boys, barefoot in the rubble, leaned close to the glowing dials as though staring into a lantern. Girls who had lost parents clutched each other, whispering, "It's American music. Real American music." They had been told that Americans were devils, incapable of compassion. Yet in those strange rhythms and cheerful melodies something human reached across the divide. Even in their grief, even with their homes destroyed, they felt the world shift. For the first time, the empire seemed fragile not only because of bombs but because of sound, because of connection. At night, when fires smoldered and the sky glowed faintly with ruin, survivors gathered around captured or abandoned radios. They didn't understand the English words, but they understood the emotion, the rise and fall of voices, the laughter between songs, the collective joy of a nation thousands of miles away. Where once the emperor's voice had been delivered with solemnity, now they heard common men speaking as equals, ordinary soldiers requesting songs, announcers joking lightly, jazz musicians improvising. It was raw, it was alive, and it was impossible to reconcile with the mechanical image of America as told by wartime propaganda. The empire had promised glory, but the radios revealed something else entirely: connection. These machines made distance irrelevant. They made silence impossible. And for civilians caught between devastation and surrender, the revelation was almost more shocking than the mushroom cloud itself. The bomb had destroyed their cities, but the radios destroyed their illusions. Word spread into whispers that became myths. Some said the Americans had machines that could summon any sound they wanted. Others believed spirits of the dead were carried in the wires. Still others swore that the music itself was a weapon, meant to weaken Japanese resolve. But beneath all speculation lay the same truth. The Americans possessed technology that blurred the line between reality and miracle. For civilians staring at broken walls and empty skies, that truth would never be forgotten. And so, in those final days of the Pacific War, when an empire gasped its last breath, Japanese civilians heard something that seemed impossible. After bombs, after fire, after the silence of death itself, the Americans played music. By the summer of 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered its most desperate stage. The Japanese Empire, once a vast power stretching across Asia and the Pacific Islands, was crumbling. Years of relentless blockades had starved its people. Its navy, once a formidable spearhead across the Pacific, had been reduced to skeleton fleets. Its air force, crippled by losses and fuel shortages, relied more and more on kamikaze desperation than strategic strength. The nation itself was exhausted. Cities burned from B-29 firebombings. Millions lived in the ruins of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, where wooden homes had turned to ash in waves of incendiary hellfire. Even before the atomic bombs, the war had already hollowed out the core of the empire. Yet amidst this devastation, the Japanese state clung fiercely to control. Propaganda saturated every corner of life. Radios in Japan were not tools of freedom, but weapons of command. The government's broadcasts filled the airwaves with solemn speeches of the emperor, proclamations of inevitable victory, and orchestras of militaristic marches designed to stir resolve. Civilians were told that Americans were monsters, destroyers, inhuman creatures driven only by violence and greed. The very notion that these same enemies could broadcast laughter, music, or warmth was inconceivable. In the eyes of the empire, radios were sacred instruments of unity, their frequencies carefully curated to keep civilians loyal and soldiers obedient. In contrast, the Americans treated radios as extensions of the individual soldier's lifeline. Every battalion, every squad, every armored column marched with the chatter of voices flowing invisibly above them, while Japanese forces relied on runners, shouted orders, or rigid chain-of-command communications. The Americans carried their networks across jungle, ocean, and sky. It was this invisible web that gave their movements fluidity. In the Pacific Islands, it allowed scattered Marines to coordinate under cover of palm trees and volcanic cliffs. At sea, it allowed fleets stretching across horizons to fight as one organism. On land, it transformed armored columns into fast-moving predators. To German tank crews on the Western Front, American radios seemed like an unfair advantage. To Japanese civilians in 1945, they seemed like magic. The year had already brought cataclysm. In March, firestorms consumed Tokyo, killing over 100,000 in a single night. In June, Okinawa had fallen in a maelstrom of blood, the last island before the homeland itself. By August, Hiroshima had vanished in an instant beneath the atomic bomb, its people reduced to shadows burned into stone. Nagasaki followed just 3 days later. For civilians, the empire's promises of invincibility collapsed into smoke. The world they knew was ending. And then, as though to underline the futility of all resistance, another truth revealed itself. The Americans not only commanded the skies and seas, they commanded the air itself. Their radios pierced through silence like unseen daggers. Soldiers on the ground tuned in to voices of home, music drifting across the Pacific from powerful transmitters. Pilots could hear weather reports, ground orders, and when the fighting stopped, the songs of Glenn Miller or Benny Goodman. Entire fleets carried stations broadcasting entertainment to keep morale alive. It was technology designed not only to coordinate war, but to soothe weary men with reminders of the world they fought for. To Japanese civilians who stumbled upon captured sets, the experience was transformative. Unlike the monotone imperial broadcasts that dictated duty, American signals carried variety. The voices were casual, almost careless in their humanity. Soldiers called in requests for songs. Announcers cracked jokes. Jazz bands improvised freely, their notes bouncing like sparks in the night. It was sound stripped of rigidity, sound that spoke of life beyond duty. Civilians who heard it realized in an instant, the enemy was not what they had been told. The enemy laughed. The enemy sang. The enemy lived in a world of sound far broader than their empire allowed. The broader war context made this revelation even more striking. Japan had entered the conflict with technological pride. The Zero fighter had once been unmatched in agility. The Yamato battleship was the largest ever built, but these weapons, built for spectacle and domination, had been outpaced by America's relentless tide of production and innovation. The empire crafted icons of steel, but America built systems. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh and Chicago churned out not only tanks and planes, but the radios that connected them all into a single war machine. It was this quiet, invisible infrastructure that transformed battles into orchestrated symphonies. Where Japan invested in the sword, America invested in the voice. By 1945, the Japanese command was deeply aware of their communications weakness. Reports described broken chains of command, units cut off from higher orders, and desperate reliance on messengers who often never arrived. At Okinawa, entire garrisons fought to the death without updates from headquarters, isolated and blind. In contrast, American forces moved like rivers, each tributary informed by the flow of the whole. Civilians, hearing the evidence of this power through captured radios, sensed the scale of disparity. It was not merely a question of who had the bigger guns or larger fleets. The true imbalance was invisible. Networks, signals, voices. American soldiers fought with the comfort of knowing they were never alone. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, often died in silence, their last words carried only by the wind. Civilians who had endured years of rationing, bombings and endless propaganda now confronted this truth in the most unexpected way, by hearing music that did not belong to them. This contrast revealed the larger tragedy of Japan's war effort. While the empire demanded ultimate sacrifice from its people, it failed to give them tools of resilience. Technology was hoarded by the military, propaganda suffocated curiosity, and resources vanished into steel monsters that could not change the course of the war. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America gave even its ordinary soldiers devices that made them feel connected. Radios, humble boxes of dials and wires, carried more than orders. They carried morale, culture and the rhythm of home. That cultural weapon proved just as devastating as bombs. For Japanese civilians in 1945, the war's broader context framed their experience of the radios as revelation. They had lived under an empire of silence, an empire of one voice. The Americans, by contrast, revealed a world of many voices, each free, each alive. The devastation of their cities had already proved that their empire could not withstand American steel. But the music, drifting from foreign radios, proved something deeper. Their empire could not withstand American connection. In the ruins of surrender, as the rising sun empire crumbled, a secret advantage came into focus. It was not hidden in the wings of bombers or the barrels of naval artillery. It was not carried in the blueprints of the atomic bomb or the steel hulls of carriers stretching horizon to horizon. It hummed quietly in metal boxes, heavy with tubes and wires, whispering across the invisible ether. Radios, ubiquitous, unassuming but devastatingly effective, were America's hidden edge. For Japanese civilians, this discovery came like a revelation. They had endured years of broadcasts carefully controlled by the state, each word sculpted into weaponized obedience. Imperial radio spoke with one voice, the emperor's decrees, military updates stripped of detail, patriotic marches blaring with mechanical insistence. But the Americans had transformed the air into something different. Their radios were not merely transmitters of command, but lifelines, culture bearers, and morale machines. Civilians who stumbled upon American sets after bombings did not find rigid proclamations. They found humanity carried on frequency waves, music, laughter, even weather reports. The contrast was staggering. Japan's Fugo balloon bombs had once drifted across the Pacific, primitive attempts to bring the war to American soil. Yet these were blunt instruments of fire, relying on chance winds and silence. America's response was invisible but precise. Their frequency modulation radios cut through static and interference, carrying voices clean across the chaos of battle. On the front lines, they allowed a platoon pinned under fire to call for artillery with surgical accuracy. In the skies, they gave bomber formations cohesion, guiding hundreds of aircraft like the wings of a single giant bird. On the seas, they synchronized fleets that spanned hundreds of miles. Civilians who overheard American stations grasped instinctively that these machines explained much of the empire's collapse. The mysterious coordination of enemy troops, the sudden precision of artillery, the uncanny timing of bombing raids, these were not accidents. They were the product of invisible threads binding every soldier, pilot, and sailor into one body. A farmer crouching near a battered field set, listening to jazz after a bombing, could not articulate the technical details, but he understood the implication: the enemy was connected. Even Japanese officers, hardened by years of battle, admitted frustration at this unseen advantage. Reports spoke of American units that seemed to anticipate movements, of armored columns that pivoted with impossible speed, of naval task forces that fought as though guided by a single hand. German commanders had encountered the same shock in North Africa and France, where American tanks maneuvered with uncanny unity. But for Japanese civilians, hearing American music drift out of captured radios made that truth intimate. It was not abstract. It was not a report filed at headquarters. It was a voice in the rubble, speaking across oceans. The psychological impact was immense. Civilians had been told Americans were soulless, mechanical demons. Yet here were voices filled with levity, broadcasting songs that spoke of joy and sorrow, not war. For a mother clutching her child in the ruins of Hiroshima, the music suggested something unthinkable: that the enemy lived in a world richer than her own. For a teenage boy who had never questioned the emperor's voice on state radio, the sound of a swing band challenged everything he had been taught. The empire had waged war with silence, secrecy, and rigid hierarchy. America waged war with sound, openness, and connection. The hidden advantage was not only the technology itself, but how it reshaped the fabric of war. Radios gave American forces adaptability. When commanders fell, leadership shifted seamlessly. When plans faltered, units improvised without losing cohesion. By contrast, Japanese formations often disintegrated when cut off, their soldiers left to die without orders. Civilians, piecing together fragments of rumor and direct experience, began to understand the empire's strength had been brittle. America's strength was supple, invisible, and unbreakable. And still, the music remained the most haunting element. After bombings, when rubble smoldered and families wept, the radios played songs of another life. It was as if the Americans had mastered the cruelty of war and the comfort of peace simultaneously. Civilians whispered to one another. The enemy could destroy and entertain in the same breath. it seemed both terrifying and irresistible. How could an empire built on silence withstand a nation built on sound? Thus, the hidden advantage revealed itself not only in battlefield victories but in the minds of those who listened in secret. Radios became symbols of a different world, one where information flowed freely, where ordinary men could hear laughter across oceans, where music traveled farther than bombs. In the shadows of defeat, Japanese civilians recognized that the empire had lost not just to superior weapons, but to superior connection. The Americans had turned invisible frequencies into their sharpest blade, and it had cut deeper than steel ever could. The bombings had proven America's power to destroy, but the radios proved something else. America's power to connect, to remind even the enemy that beyond the fire life still played a tune. And for civilians whose faith in their empire was shattered, that realization was as devastating as any explosion. The weight of the American advantage could not be measured only in the shock of music carried across shattered cities. To understand its depth, one must descend into the engineering itself, the hidden machinery that made it possible. The backbone of this invisible empire was the SCR series of radios, most famously the SCR 508 and its kin. These were not fragile novelties, but rugged field instruments forged in the furnaces of American industry. They were designed not for elegance but for survival. Dust, mud, rain, and the chaos of battle could not silence them. The SCR 508, introduced in 1941, became the voice of armored warfare. Weighing 181 pounds, it was not small, yet it fit seamlessly inside the steel bellies of Sherman tanks and half-tracks. Its heart was frequency modulation, FM, a technology barely understood outside American laboratories before the war. Unlike amplitude modulation, which twisted signals into static and distortion under fire, FM cut cleanly through noise. The result was voices that remained clear even under artillery bombardment, or the roar of tank engines. German soldiers, straining with their FUG-5 sets, could hear only garbled commands when the battlefield boiled. American crews, by contrast, heard their officers as though they stood beside them. The SCR 508 could transmit up to 25 watts, reaching ranges of 8 miles on the move, and up to 20 when stationary with good conditions. Its precision rested on crystals, tiny oscillators that locked frequencies into place. Each set contained thousands of components, resistors, capacitors, vacuum tubes, all assembled with meticulous care. By 1944, American factories from Motorola in Chicago to Philco in Philadelphia were turning them out by the tens of thousands. On Detroit assembly lines where once automobiles had rolled, radios now poured into wooden crates marked for Europe and the Pacific. Each crate carried not just hardware, but a lifeline of command. German technology was formidable in many respects. Panther tanks, V-2 rockets, jet fighters. But in communications they lagged fatally behind. Their FUG-5 radios weighed less, but their AM signals sputtered under interference. Range was often limited to just a few kilometers. Worse, frequencies drifted, requiring constant tuning. On a battlefield where minutes decided survival, those lost seconds meant death. German commanders often relied on flags, flares, or messengers even in 1944, a method centuries old. American tank crews, by contrast, could coordinate flanking maneuvers in real time. Their voices carried instantly across engines, gunfire, and smoke. The technical gap was not lost on those who faced it. Reports from German panzer officers lamented how American columns seemed to anticipate every move, striking flanks and withdrawing before counterattacks could form. In truth, it was not clairvoyance but clarity, radios transmitting at the speed of thought. Japanese officers observed the same on Pacific Islands, where American squads shifted positions fluidly, while their own troops waited for orders that never came. Civilians who touched these machines after bombings could not grasp the details, the wattage, the circuitry, the crystal tuning. Yet they could sense the power. Turning a dial brought forth not silence but connection. It was as if the air itself had been harnessed, transformed into a highway of voices and melodies. Engineers like Edwin Armstrong, the father of FM radio, had unleashed a revolution years earlier in American laboratories. Now his innovation marched at the front lines of history. Consider the scale. By 1945, The US Army Signal Corps had deployed over 2.4 million radio sets across the globe. No other nation could rival such saturation. From foxholes in France to carriers in the Pacific, the American voice was everywhere. It was not only a tool of war, it was the nervous system of a vast military organism. Civilians, hearing the echoes of this network in their ruined streets, were witnessing the tip of an industrial iceberg that stretched across continents. Factories worked ceaselessly to feed this demand. Motorola, RCA, Western Electric, all giants of peacetime industry, turned their minds and machines toward war. Radios rolled off assembly lines with the same relentless rhythm as rifles and helmets. The United States had not only outbuilt its enemies in tanks and planes, but in the invisible infrastructure that made those machines deadly. To Japanese civilians, the technical superiority was not written in numbers but in experience. Where their own radios served only as shrines to imperial power, American radios served as bridges. Each note of music that reached their ears was the end of a long chain, engineers soldering circuits, workers tightening bolts, logisticians loading crates onto ships, soldiers carrying sets through jungles and across beaches. Behind every melody drifting over ruins was an empire of innovation, humming like the radios themselves. The engineering edge was quiet, unseen, and yet decisive. Bombs leveled cities, but it was the radios that ensured the bombs fell where they were meant to, that fleets moved as one, that soldiers never fought alone. The civilians who heard music after the bombings were, unknowingly, eavesdropping on the beating heart of American warfare. They were listening to victory in its purest technical form. And for those who understood even a fragment of this truth, the realization was devastating. Japan had waged war with swords sharpened into steel tanks and planes. America had waged war with voices sharpened into networks. The empire of the rising sun was falling, and it was falling not only to fire, but to frequency. September 19, 1944. The Lorraine region of France lay under a sky of grey clouds. At dawn, a thick mist curled over fields still wet from autumn rain. Out of that fog came the growl of engines, the unmistakable thunder of German panthers, their silhouettes looming like predators in the distance. 39 machines of steel, with 75 guns primed for slaughter, advanced toward American lines near the small town of Aracourt. German commanders believed victory certain. The terrain favored their armor. Their tanks were larger, heavier, deadlier. Against them stood American Shermans and Hellcats, lighter, faster, but fragile in comparison. By logic alone, the outcome seemed predetermined. Yet what followed defied that logic. The Panthers, moving as solitary beasts, advanced methodically. Each crew relied on vision, on rigid orders passed from command vehicles. Communication sputtered and lagged. When the lead tanks crested a hill, they were greeted not by scattered, panicked resistance, but by an enemy that seemed to know their every move. From the fog emerged Hellcats, darting like ghosts. Shermans flanked with uncanny precision, their movements choreographed as if rehearsed on a stage. Orders crackled instantly from tank to tank, platoon to platoon. Within minutes, German formations were in disarray. American tank crews, guided by their SCR 508 radios, fought as a single organism. When one unit spotted a Panther's vulnerable flank, the information spread in seconds. When artillery was needed, coordinates shot through the ether with no delay. The German tanks, powerful but isolated, found themselves struck from angles they could not anticipate. A Panther's thick frontal armor meant little when Shermans appeared at its sides, their 75 guns pounding at weak points. Within hours, the battlefield became a graveyard of burning steel. Of the 39 Panthers, more than half were lost. The Americans suffered losses, yes, but the kill ratio stunned even hardened observers. Reports filed afterward by German commanders revealed their confusion. How could inferior machines maneuver with such unity? Why did American columns pivot like rivers, splitting and rejoining at will? They could not grasp that the answer was not in the tanks, but in the invisible threads of radio. Each Sherman, each Hellcat, was a node in a vast web. Together they fought not as individual crews, but as extensions of a single, unseen mind. This was not an isolated incident. At El Guetta in Tunisia, At Aracourt in Lorraine, at countless crossroads and villages, radios gave Americans an edge that multiplied their strength. In the Pacific, on volcanic rock and coral atolls, the same principle held true. Marines advancing under fire could call instantly for air support. Infantry pinned by machine guns could summon artillery with precision strikes. Japanese defenders, lacking comparable communication, often never knew what hit them until it was too late. For civilians who later heard American broadcasts, these victories explained the impossible. Why did American fleets appear in unison, their guns coordinated to devastating effect? Why did bombers seem to strike with eerie precision, even after hours of flight across hostile skies? The radios told the story. The music that drifted into ruins was proof of a system that had orchestrated destruction on a scale never before seen. German reports capture the bitterness of realization. One panzer officer described the Americans as moving like a swarm with one mind. Another lamented that without clear communication, his tanks had fought blind. Japanese diaries echo the same despair. At Okinawa, entire garrisons perished cut off from headquarters, their last messages lost in silence. Meanwhile, American units adapted, regrouped, and struck again. The battlefields themselves bore the evidence. At Aracourt, burned panthers stood as blackened monuments to a doctrine that prized individual strength but neglected unity. Civilians walking past wreckage months later could still smell the charred remains of crews entombed within. They whispered that the Americans had some secret weapon, a way of seeing through fog and forest. They were right, but the weapon was not a new gun or armored hull. It was a voice, carried on frequencies that turned chaos into order. The Hellcat, America's fastest tank destroyer, embodied this truth. Capable of speeds up to 55 miles per hour, it relied not on armor, but agility. Yet without radios, its speed would have meant nothing. Radios transformed velocity into lethality, guiding Hellcats into ambushes, calling them away before counterstrikes landed. German Panther crews, proud of their machines' thick armor and powerful cannon, could not fathom how lighter enemies bested them time and again. The answer lay not in steel, but in connection. For Japanese civilians, the aftershocks of these truths came in subtler ways. When music drifted into their bombed-out neighborhoods, they were hearing the same networks that had guided Hellcats in Europe and Shermans across North Africa. The laughter of American soldiers carried by radio waves was the echo of the same systems that had directed fleets into Tokyo Bay. The technology that comforted men on one side shattered illusions on the other. The numbers spoke volumes. At Aracourt, German forces lost over 85 tanks across the campaign. American losses were less than half that number, despite their vehicles being technically inferior. Kill ratios as high as 5-to-1 stunned analysts. It was not luck. It was the manifestation of invisible communication, turning fragile machines into instruments of collective might. After-action reports from the German side often end in despair. One commander admitted, "They strike as though they know our blind spots." Another wrote bitterly, "We have the better tanks. They have the better war." For civilians who later pieced these fragments together, the revelation was sobering. The empire had promised that spirit and sacrifice would defeat material strength. But on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, spirit fell silent when cut off from command. The Americans never fought alone. Their radios ensured that even in the fog of war, voices carried across the din, weaving men into an unbreakable fabric of unity. Thus, each decisive battle reinforced the same truth. It was not the sharpness of steel, but the clarity of sound that determined victory. And for those who listened in secret, the music drifting from American radios was more than entertainment. It was the echo of entire armies moving as one, proof that the enemy's strength lay in something their empire had never mastered, the art of connection. Across the vast theaters of war, victory was not only measured in territory gained or enemies destroyed, it was written in the unseen psychology of soldiers and civilians alike. The advantage of American radios rippled far beyond tactics. It reached into the minds of men, eroding the will of enemies and binding comrades in steel threads of unity. German commanders had known the sting of this imbalance. Their panzers, unmatched in armor and firepower, often faltered when command tanks were destroyed. The chain of leadership snapped like brittle glass, leaving units paralyzed. Reports from the Eastern Front revealed the same. When radios failed, cohesion dissolved, and formations became little more than scattered machines awaiting death. The Americans, by contrast, thrived in the chaos. If a commander fell, another voice immediately assumed control. Orders shifted without delay. Soldiers felt connected to something larger, even when surrounded by fire and ruin. It was this invisible confidence, the knowledge that one was never alone, that shaped the psychological edge. In the Pacific, the contrast was even starker. Japanese units cut off from headquarters fought to the death not because they were commanded, but because silence left them no alternative. They died in isolation, their courage undeniable, yet tragically wasted. Americans, advancing yard by yard across coral and volcanic rock, could whisper into microphones and summon artillery, tanks, or naval bombardment. The psychological weight was immense. Every Marine, every infantryman carried the assurance that his voice could move mountains of steel. For Japanese soldiers facing them, the realization was crushing. No matter how fiercely they resisted, the enemy's unity never broke. Civilians felt this disparity in quieter, haunting ways. For years they had been told the empire's unity came from spirit, Yamato Damashi, the soul of Japan. But spirit could not carry voices across bombed-out cities. Spirit could not replace the silence of a dead commander. When civilians heard American radios filling the night with music, they saw not only foreign culture, but a kind of emotional infrastructure. These voices connected men thousands of miles away. They reminded soldiers of families, of cities untouched by war, of the lives waiting for them at home. For Japanese civilians starved of freedom and fed only the emperor's solemn proclamations, the difference was almost unbearable. The impact was not limited to morale. Radios reshaped strategy itself. American generals could maneuver divisions as if moving chess pieces, confident their orders would reach every unit. German and Japanese commanders, by contrast, often found themselves blind, their carefully laid plans dissolving when communication broke down. The Americans built strategy around connection, and the enemy bled under the weight of isolation. Psychologically, the difference manifested in fear and awe. German tank crews cursed the American radios in their after-action reports, insisting that inferior Shermans must have been guided by some unnatural advantage. Japanese civilians whispered myths about American machines that pulled voices from the sky. To them it seemed the enemy had mastered not just weapons but the very essence of sound, bending the air itself into a weapon. The idea of Americans laughing and playing music after bombings seemed almost cruel, yet it also revealed a resilience that the empire could not match. For every Japanese family huddled in silence, an American family across the ocean was serenaded with updates and entertainment, their voices carried effortlessly to soldiers at the front. The psychological toll on German and Japanese troops was profound. Fighting an enemy who always seemed one step ahead, always coordinated, always able to call upon reinforcements, bred despair. Isolation bred paranoia. Soldiers doubted their leaders, feared their silence, and eventually surrendered to inevitability. American radios turned battles into performances where the enemy never knew the script. For civilians, hearing that music confirmed their deepest dread. The enemy was not only stronger but smarter, and above all connected. For Americans themselves, radios offered more than utility. They were comfort, camaraderie, and hope. A soldier crouching in a foxhole, his rifle slick with rain, could hear the voice of his commander miles away and know he was part of something greater. Tank crews, sealed in steel coffins, could share jokes between machines, laughter breaking the monotony of fear. At night, when bombers soared back across the Pacific, exhausted crews tuned into armed forces radio, the swing of Glenn Miller reminding them why they fought. This psychological resilience proved as vital as any weapon. In contrast, Japanese soldiers died in silence, their last moments carried only by the wind. Civilians wept in silence, the emperor's words a distant echo on state broadcasts. Silence was the empire's inheritance, and it proved fatal. Radios turned the American army into a community, and that community's strength proved unshakable. The strategic consequences were immense. Battles that should have lasted weeks crumbled in days. German offensives sputtered under the weight of fractured communication. Japanese garrisons, cut off and surrounded, fought hopelessly until annihilation. Meanwhile, American units adapted, shifted and pressed forward with confidence. The edge was not merely mechanical, it was psychological, weaving unity where the enemy unraveled. And so, in the minds of those who endured the war, radios became symbols of more than technology. To Americans, they were voices of survival. To Germans, they were sources of envy and despair. To Japanese civilians, they were miracles and curses playing music in the ruins of empire. The psychological war was won as decisively as the physical one. In the silence of their cities, Japanese civilians realized the truth. Connection was the greatest weapon of all. When the war ended, and the ashes of empire cooled, the lesson of those invisible voices endured. Radios had not only shaped battles, they had reshaped the very logic of warfare. In Tokyo Bay, as the Japanese delegation signed the instruments of surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the hum of American radios still filled the decks. Orders moved seamlessly between ships, aircraft circled above in precise formations, and across the ocean back home, civilians heard the news within hours. An empire had fallen, and it had fallen not only to bombs and bullets, but to networks of sound that bound the enemy into a single will. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel of Germany had once admitted bitterly, "We built better tanks, but you built tanks that worked together." His words captured the legacy of America's radios more clearly than any technical report. Connection had outweighed armor. Clarity had outweighed brute force. Where enemies relied on individual strength, America relied on collective unity, amplified by technology. For Japanese civilians, the memory of hearing music after bombings lingered long into the post-war years. It haunted them as both insult and revelation. How could the same enemy who reduced their cities to rubble also carry laughter and jazz into the night sky? Some remembered it with bitterness, others with awe, but none could forget. The radios became symbols of a new world, a world where communication traveled faster than armies, where sound became as powerful as steel. In the years that followed, these lessons spread into the fabric of modern war. During the Cold War, the United States invested not only in nuclear arsenals but in communication networks that could survive any catastrophe. The concept of network-centric warfare, born from the whispers of SCR 508 sets on the battlefields of France and the Pacific, became doctrine. By the time American tanks rolled into Kuwait during the Gulf War of 1991, the lineage was clear. Radios had evolved into satellites, into GPS, into digital networks, but the principle was the same. Victory belonged not to the strongest machine, but to the machine that could speak and be heard. Civilians, too, felt the echo of that transformation. Post-war Japan embraced radio not as a weapon, but as a lifeline. Commercial stations flourished, carrying music, entertainment, and voices from around the world. Where once the state had used airwaves to enforce silence, now the people used them to rebuild culture. The very tool that had revealed the empire's weakness became an engine of its recovery. Radios played in crowded markets, in quiet villages, in the homes of families rebuilding their lives. Music that once symbolized the enemy became a soundtrack to peace. Yet the memory of those wartime broadcasts never fully faded. Veterans recalled how a simple voice over the radio steadied their nerves under fire. Civilians remembered the shock of hearing foreign songs in the ruins. Historians traced the fall of empires not only through bombs and battles, but through frequencies, and always the lesson returned. Connection is survival. Even today, when satellites circle the Earth and drones communicate across continents, the principle holds. The radios of World War II were primitive compared to modern networks, yet their impact was profound. They taught the world that war is not won by strength alone, but by unity. Unity forged in the invisible realm of sound. The legacy endures in every command post, every encrypted transmission, every soldier who hears a voice in his headset and knows he is not alone. It endures in the stories of Japanese civilians who in their darkest hour heard music when they expected only silence. It endures in the recognition that America's greatest weapon was not steel or fire, but the ability to bind men together through invisible threads of communication. And so the final lesson of those radios is not merely about war, it is about humanity itself. When bombs fall and cities burn, when empires rise and collapse, what endures is the voice, the connection between one soul and another. In 1945, Japanese civilians stood amid ruins and listened to music carried by enemy radios. It was shocking, surreal, unforgettable. It was proof that even in destruction, sound could carry life. The empire had built monuments of steel and demanded silence. The Americans had built networks of voices and carried music. In the end, silence lost. Connection prevailed, and in modern war, as in life, speed defeats armor, unity defeats isolation, and the human voice is mightier than the sword.